Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
Latin American philosophy.
I, Nezahualcoyotl, ask this. Is it true one really lives on the earth?
In America, philosophy begins with Latin American philosophy.
Not forever on earth, only a little while here.
How does Latin American philosophy distinguish itself from European and American philosophy?
Though it be jade, it falls apart. Though it be gold, it wears away. Though it be quetzal feathers, they are torn asunder.
Our guest is Joseph Orosco, author of Cesar Chavez and the Common Sense of Nonviolence.
What we need to do as Latin Americans is define who we are by going back to our roots.
Recorded in front of a live audience at Oregon State University in Corvallis.
The idea of Latin America should stand for preserving the best of Western heritage.
Latin American philosophy.
Coming up on Philosophy Talk.
Hi, I'm Josh Landy.
And I'm Ray Briggs.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Philosophy Talk.
Learn more about the program by getting our monthly newsletter. Just text the word philosophy to 22828. That's 22828.
And get access to our library of more than 500 episodes by becoming a subscriber at our website, philosophytalk.org.
Now, on with the show.
This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything.
Except your intelligence. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Today we're coming to you from Oregon State University in Corvallis.
Our thinking originates at Philosopher's Corner on Stanford University.
Welcome everyone to Philosophy Talk. Our topic today is Latin American philosophy.
Latin America means all of the Spanish and Portuguese speaking parts of the Americas. We'll just say American philosophy when we mean the US and Canada, and I'm going to apologize now in advance for the arrogance of that custom.
Now, John, some people, no doubt, will find talk of a distinctively Latin American philosophy a little puzzling. People like that will say the problems of philosophy are universal and timeless. They're problems that confront all human beings everywhere, independently of their historical milieu or cultural context.
And if that's your guiding conception of philosophy, it is hard to see how there can be anything deeply distinctive about Latin American philosophy, or Canadian philosophy, or North American philosophy, or British philosophy. You feel the problems of philosophy are timeless. They might be formulated in slightly different terms and idioms and in different languages. That might make some difference. But basically, at the bottom, philosophy is philosophy, no matter where, when, or in what language you do it.
So you've just articulated a kind of Platonistic ideal of philosophy, John. That says, philosophy is about timeless problems addressed with timeless methods. That conception of philosophy probably is dominant in Anglo-American circles like the ones we hang out in mostly.
Yeah, but of course the circles we hang out in are pretty parochial. There are alternative conceptions of philosophy which would make the idea of a Latin American philosophy much more compelling and natural.
Right. Think about a broadly pragmatist conception of philosophy, for example. The pragmatists say that if philosophy is to be more than just an idle wheel spinning, then both its questions and its answers to those questions have to somehow arise out of and make contact with the lived experiences of culturally and historically situated human beings.
Do pragmatists know how much fun it is to be a idly spinning wheel in a cloistered office in an ivory tower? But at any rate, if you are a pragmatist, you will really see how there could be a distinct Latin American philosophy, a philosophy essentially tied to the very interesting, peculiar, unique story of Latin American life, culture, history, and society.
So let's take a look. When we look at Latin American philosophy on the ground, as it's actually done, John, well, what do we find? Something distinctively Latin American, or something that looks a lot like Anglo-American philosophy or European philosophy?
Well, actually, can you find both? For one thing that's quite special, there are contemporary echoes of indigenous philosophical ideas dating even from pre-Columbian times.
Well, that's certainly distinctively Latin American, no doubt about that.
But then there's also a universalist strand, especially on metaphysics and epistemology. You could be in Latin America, you could be in Oxford, maybe you could be in Athens 2,000 years ago.
So you're thinking about the Latin American philosophers who have basically imported and built upon European philosophical ideas from positivism and phenomenology right down to existentialism and even our own favorite Anglo-American analytic philosophy.
Yes, but when you move to social and political philosophy, there is definitely a distinctive Latin American philosophy. It's tied with a long struggle against European tyranny and American tyranny, and with the whole issue of native rights.
So it's no accident you're saying that Latin America is the home both of liberation theology, but also of liberation philosophy.
Many of the themes of Latin American philosophy, social and political philosophy, begin with a fellow I used to teach in my freshman course, Bartolomé de las Casas, who was a truly fascinating figure.
Tell me more about him.
Well, de las Casas settled with his family in Hispaniola just 10 years after Columbus's first voyage. He grew up in an encomienda system. That means that farms and plantations prospered based on enslaving the Native Americans. But as he grew older, he saw the injustice of this. He became a prolific writer, a priest, later a monk, and then in the last part of his career, moved back to Spain trying to convince the Holy Roman Emperor and the papal legates to abolish slavery.
Yeah, but wait a minute. I abolished native slavery, but wasn't he a guy who advocated African slavery? I don't think that's so cool.
Well, that's a bit of a bum rap. He was so moved by the plight of native Indian slavery that at one time in an early essay he said it would be better to move to African slavery, which was already thriving, so he didn't start it. But he was very embarrassed by this and apologized for it in later years.
Well, John, look, I suspect we're nearing the limits of our own knowledge of Latin American philosophy, but our guest, Joseph Orosco, professor of philosophy from right here at OSU, he'll help us continue the conversation and deepen our education.
And we'll want our live audience here in Corvallis to join in the conversation, too.
But first, our roving philosophical reporter, Caitlin Esch, talks to someone who takes Latin American philosophy out of the classroom and applies it in the real world. She files this report.
When he was 18 years old, Javier Lara left Mexico and immigrated to the United States. For 7 years, he worked as a farmhand up and down the West Coast, harvesting asparagus, tomatoes, and Christmas trees.
The climate conditions were very heavy, a lot of heat, snow, and we were exposed to work, under those conditions. We worked long hours, and we end up getting probably way lower than the minimum wage.
Lara says some days he would only make $14.
It was a surprise to me to realize that the United States, one of the most great nations, this was very common.
After a while, Lara reached a breaking point. He decided he had to change his life, so he studied English, took a few classes at a community college, and started learning about what it means to be a Mexican in the United States.
And as I learned more about this, I realized, something deep is going on here. It was not just the fact that I was exploited, on the workforce, but it was something more.
Lara put himself through college, earning a bachelor's degree in ethnic studies from Oregon State University. He took philosophy classes and started applying what he learned in the classroom to life.
On peace studies, we cover Gandhi, we cover Cesar Chavez, we cover Martin Luther King.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop.
So all these people, they were fighting against literally the same force that I was exposed to, right?
Now, as a community organizer for PICUN, Oregon's farm worker union, Lara helps laborers fight unsafe work conditions, wage theft, and harassment.
A lot of workers, they don't want to lose their job. So even though they're exposed to humiliations, they're exposed to work sometimes 16 hours a day, every day, and not getting paid, for that time and just getting paid for 8 hours. But at the same time, they've been treated like, if you want to leave, well, you can leave, go home. There's 100 people behind you.
Another woman came to him recently after she was threatened and blackmailed by her boss.
She's been having sexual harassment, from her boss, just directly asking her, if you want your job, you have to do what I ask you to do.
Lara says it's his responsibility as a college-educated former farmhand to take what he's learned in the classroom and fight for change in the real world. For Philosophy Talk, I'm Caitlin Esch.
I'm John Perry, along with Ken Taylor. And you're listening to Philosophy Talk, coming to you from Oregon State University in Corvallis.
And we're joined now by Joseph Orosco. He's a professor of philosophy right here at OSU in Corvallis, where he's also the director of the Peace Studies program. Joseph, welcome to Philosophy Talk.
It's an honor to be here, and welcome to Corvallis.
Well, thank you. Joseph, tell us just a bit about your background and how you got interested in Latin American philosophy.
Well, like many things, I blame my mother.
You were born a Latin American philosopher?
Well, I wasn't born a Latin American philosopher, but I was born in Latin America. I was born in Quito, Ecuador. My mother was an exchange student from New Mexico and studying there. And it was through her influence that I came to have an interest in the social and political movements of Latin America. The interesting thing about Latin American philosophy is that this has been a growing field that has not existed as an academic field of study for very long. In fact, I never have taken a class formally in Latin American philosophy. This was something that I had to sort of piece together by myself, study with professors by myself, and it's only been within the past maybe 5 or 10 years that there has been a movement of academic programs across the country studying this.
Now, one thing that's going on in science and anthropology and generally is a reevaluation and discovering all sorts of new things about pre-Columbian Americas. A lot more people, perhaps, than were thought, a lot more sophisticated cultures. What about pre-Columbian philosophy? Is there anything to be said? Is there anything known? Is there any interesting speculations?
Well, the philosophy that I know best is the thought of the ancient Aztecs, or as they refer to themselves as the Mexica or the Nahua people. And what's interesting about their work is that it really challenges in some ways our conceptions of what philosophy is about or how we should understand philosophy. Because many of the works of the ancient Aztecs were destroyed by the Spanish conquistadors, so we don't have a lot of sources of their books, but they did something very interesting. They expressed their philosophical thought through what they called flower poems, or in Nahuatl, Insochito Inquicato. These were songs that were meant for ceremonies, but what we start to see is that there were philosopher kings amongst the Aztecs who expressed philosophical thoughts in these flower poems. And I have an example if I can share with you.
Okay,
sure, yeah.
Sure.
So the poem that I'm going to read to you was from a famous wise man by the name of Nezahualcoyotl, which means hungry wolf. He was a true philosopher king. He was the leader of the city of Texcoco, which was part of the Aztec Empire, and so he was a leader but also a philosopher. And so one of his poems begins this way. I, Nezahualcoyotl, ask this. Is it true one really lives on the earth? Not forever on earth, only a little while here. Though it be jade, it falls apart. Though it be gold, it wears away. Though it be quetzal feathers, they are torn asunder. Not forever on this earth, only a little while here.
Well, that's interesting.
Wow.
Well, let me ask you a question about that. So that's pre-Columbian. Did pre-Columbian culture, does it have any echoes? Does it reverberate at all through contemporary Latin American culture? Was this taken up, or was it just a culture that the conquistadors destroyed and was gone?
No, I think that it exists still today in many indigenous communities throughout Latin America, and including the indigenous communities that exist here in the United States, of people who have come up from places like Oaxaca or Chiapas. And these are perspectives about how to live with one another and how to live with the earth. And these were perspectives that the Aztecs were very concerned with. In this poem, you hear them trying to understand, what is our purpose here on life? And is any of this really real? What is the truth of our existence? And the emphasis that they give over and over and over in their poems is this kind of the precariousness of life, how we should never really be settled and understand that things are very dangerous. The conception of the world for the ancient Aztecs was living on a jagged edge.
But it isn't just an ancient conception, it's a conception that still lives in some communities that are historically connected.
Yeah, if you talk to indigenous people today, they'll talk about the precariousness of their lives and how things are built around suffering and pain and trying to deal with that.
This is a special edition of Philosophy Talk, coming to you from Oregon State University in Corvallis. We're discussing Latin American philosophy with Joseph Orosco from OSU.
How is Latin America different from the United States? And how is Latin American philosophy different from American philosophy? What are the most important trends in Latin American philosophy?
Social activism and Latin American philosophy, along with questions from our live audience when Philosophy Talk continues.
así serán los frutos que recogerás. Siembra.
Welcome back to Philosophy Talk. I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor, and we're discussing Latin American philosophy with Joseph Orosco in front of a live audience at Oregon State University in Corvallis.
Join the discussion by stepping up to the microphones on either side of the stage. Has Jose Ortega y Gasset or Jorge Luis Borges or liberation philosophy or liberation theology or pre-Columbian ideas shaped your way of thinking? What have you gotten from Latin America philosophy in your life?
Joseph, I want to go back to the issue we raised in the opening framing section. So some philosophers think of philosophy as this universal thing, timeless problems approached with timeless methods. You know, the idiom might be a little different, but the problems are essentially the same. Some people think, pragmatists tend to think, no, there aren't any universal problems. There are the problems that are tied to a particular culture and epoch, and philosophy has to make contact with the concrete lived experience of real people living their lives. So in Latin American philosophy, which is it? Is it universalist? Is it more like the pragmatist, more local and culturally specific? Which dominates?
Well, there's both of those, but I think that the dominant trend in Latin American philosophy is to say that Latin America is a unique and distinct place from Europe and North America, and that the attempt of Latin American philosophers is to try to define and explain what is the unique worldview that comes from Latin America that can be an alternative to what comes out of the United States and Latin America and Europe, that is.
So Latin America is a distinct place. What's distinctive about Latin America that would give rise to a distinctive philosophy? What's the distinctive situation that philosophy would glob onto and say something distinctive about life and going forward and all that?
Well, the Latin American philosophers that I know about most say that what we need to pay attention to, first off and foremost, is the relationship of Latin America to the United States, that the relationship has always been one of subordination, and that the attempt of Latin American philosophers is to try to figure out how is Latin American life different than the culture in the United States? How do we live life differently? And in what sense can we say that maybe we provide, that is in Latin America, an alternative to the kind of ways of life in the United States that many find materialistic, dedicated to wealth above all, and also dedicated to imperial power around the world? So how can we define an ideal for humanity that would be different?
Often when I talk to Latin American philosophers and Latin American intellectuals generally, I get the sense that they feel that America has actually done a poor job of carrying on the finer parts of European civilization, and that at least in certain parts of Latin America, like maybe Buenos Aires, the finer parts of the intellectual tradition continue in a way that they don't in North America. Is that just my being defensive, or is that element really there?
No, there was a philosopher in 1900 by the name of José Enrique Rodó, who claimed, he wrote a book that was comparing Latin America to the United States, and he says of the United States, while I admire the United States, I do not love her. And the emphasis there was he felt that what was to admire about the United States was its Puritan work ethic, its enthusiasm for liberty, its willpower, but there was a dark side to this, which was a vulgarity, a materialistic spirit, spiritually empty individualism. And in his view, that is Rodó, the idea of Latin America should stand for preserving the best of Western heritage, talking about the emphasis of the Greeks, truth, beauty, and goodness. These kinds of values he felt were not preserved very well in a United States that was dedicated to the dollar.
Now, is this perspective aligned with a class distinction? Is this the kind of view that philosophers who have horses and play golf and so forth and so on are likely to have, as opposed to a much different philosophy that percolates up from the people that are working in the fields and so forth?
Yeah, I think that's very true. Rodó was an upper-class intellectual. There's another philosopher that's very interesting by the name of José Martí, who said that what we need to do as Latin Americans is define who we are by going back to our roots. And one of the things he said was that we really need to study the history of America, he said, from the Incas to the present, details and letters and everything, so that if it means that we overlook the Greeks, that's okay. He says, quote, our Greece must take priority over the Greece which is not ours. And so that means trying to understand that pre-Columbian idea.
Well, there might be some possibilities there, because just the poem you gave us was, I think, about as much as we have of Heraclitus, and there's been probably 10,000 articles written on
Absolutely.
Heraclitus. So,
But I want to think a little bit deeper about America as a problem that gives rise to distinctively Latin American philosophizing, right? I mean, American philosophers. I mean, I don't think there's an epoch. Is there a time in the history of American philosophy where America's place in the global order is what prompted philosophers to think what they think? I mean, American philosophy is driven by all kinds of things. There's all this history of connection to European philosophy, but then the rise of science, and there's not much thinking in distinctively American philosophy thinking about class struggle or anything like that. That all comes from European struggles. I mean, so America as a problem. It sounds like you're saying that for lots of Latin American philosophers, the impetus for philosophizing is this big hegemon to the north, who's culturally imperialistic and militarily and economically, and the question is, what should we be in opposition to that, kind of?
Absolutely. And actually, this has resonance with American philosophers. I mean, if you think about William James and some of his work was motivated to be thinking about how do we understand the American character? How do we understand the experience of America? And one of the things that really bothered James was the question of American imperialism in the Philippines. And so this has resonance with Latin American philosophers who want to try to understand how can we have an authentic and unique voice in the philosophical world stage by getting out from underneath the influence of Europe and North America.
Okay, so tell me a little bit about what that authentic, unique voice, what some range of philosophers have said about the authentic and unique voice of Latin America and Latin Americans. I mean, how would you characterize that voice?
I think that the figure to turn to here is a figure in Mexico right now by the name of Enrique Dussel, who says that what we need to understand is to try to recuperate the values of the pre-Columbian thinkers as a way of critiquing North American or European globalization. How do we talk about development, trying to satisfy the needs of a population, but without assuming that the way to do this is by copying the United States in terms of its development, moving away from that kind of ideas of materialism, of consumption? How can we create different kinds of democratic communities that touch base in alternative theories of democracy that don't necessarily come from Greece? And there's emphasis in that in Incan and in Mayan and Aztec thinking.
when I read De las Casas, he seems like a very sensible guy. I mean, I'm not really big on religious philosophy, but, given his background and his deep Catholicism, he had very good and sensible instincts, and he was a good writer and a clear writer. When I go up to the 1600s and early 1700s and look at the philosophers in North America, you get real nutcases like Jonathan Edwards and Cotton Mather and people that are really on this Puritan angle of things that it just strikes you as really pathological. So it seems to me at that point, say 1650, 1675, 1700, Latin America had a big head start on producing reasonable philosophy. Is there still a difference between a Catholic-centered point of view and a Puritan-centered point of view that comes out?
Well, this is something to pay attention to, right? We tend to think of the United States as a center of intellectual life and Harvard as a place that was started by the Puritans as an intellectual home. What we need to realize is that some of the oldest centers of higher learning in the Americas are not in the United States, but in Mexico. And so there was large traditions of philosophical thinking going on way before there was anyone in North America. And so there is a sense of development of philosophical thinking that goes through many, many different traditions. And one of them is Catholic scholastic thinking that was very, very prominent in Latin America at the time that you're talking about. So there was very sophisticated thinking going on in Latin America, not just amongst the Native Americans.
You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're coming to you from the Oregon State University in Corvallis. We're in front of a live audience here, and we've got members of that live audience love to join this conversation. Welcome to Philosophy Talk. And tell us your name and tell us where you're from, and then give us your comment or question.
Hi there. I'm Dr. Ramsey Tracy at Western Oregon University. I studied at Tulane. I'm a Mexicanist and also do Caribbean cultural studies. I was just curious what the panel would have to say about describing Latin America as a single entity versus a multiple entity.
That's a very good point. There are many philosophers in Latin America amongst the tradition who say that we can't really talk about Latin American philosophy because it's such a diverse place. However, there are others who say that there are significant experiences that unite the continent together, and primarily the influence of Western imperialism on that brings certain kinds of experiences that can unite all of these people together, at least in sort of an understanding that we need to create something differently than what we see in the United States and in Europe.
My angle would be it's probably a gross oversimplification that distorts, but compared to the whole idea of talking about Asian philosophy and Asian thought, it's not a big problem.
But is there, but I don't know a lot about Latin American culture in detail. Is there a pan-Latinist kind of movement? Like there's a pan-Africanist movement, right? And many people resist that because they think Africa is a multiplicity, and other people think, no, that's the way forward. I mean, is there any dynamic like that in Latin American intellectual life?
There is some. There was a philosopher in Mexico by the name of Jose Vasconcelos who believed that what united Latin America was its racial differences, that what was valued in Latin America was the mixing and the mestizaje, the mixing of different races, that made it a very unique place, different from North America, different from Europe, which tended to be places of white supremacy. And so that the future of humanity could be seen in nascent form in Latin America through the kinds of mixing of indigenous European and African peoples.
So that raises another kind of question that I wanted to ask you about. So one of the things you were talking earlier, sort of at the level of, Latin America as a place, as a big, complicated place. But what about ideas of the self and what a self is and how a self relates to a collectivity? Because what you said to me just now, to us just now, suggests to me that maybe there are different ideas of autonomy. The Enlightenment gave us this idea of autonomy of man as such, devoid of local particularity. I wonder, does that Enlightenment ideal have a deep hold in Latin American thinking, or not a deep hold, or what?
I think there's a lot of suspicion about that idea of a severe kind of individualism or severe individual autonomy. There seems to be an emphasis of trying to figure out how we are in community with others. And this goes back to indigenous thinking, an emphasis on community and living together, and trying to figure out how we can do that, not by thinking of ourselves as atomistic individuals who have to come together in terms of a social contract, but how we assume that there are already ways of life that we're embedded in, and how do we give our philosophical perspective that recognizes those ties of community. And that includes community with nature. A big emphasis in Latin American thought, going back to the indigenous ways of life, is thinking about nature as an agent or as a player in our community. And that's something that is not necessarily quite as prominent in European thinking.
So we got more questions on this side of the room.
John Dorbolo, here at Oregon State. Luis Borges is a great writer of the 20th century who expressed strong philosophical ideas in many of his stories and essays. And in those stories, many of those stories that resonate the most for people, there's a circularity that happens. I think of the sucking stones or labyrinths and those kinds of stories. And that idea has taken root even now in critiques of consciousness. And he seems to be one of the origins of that idea. The poem that you read, the flower poem from the Philosopher King, seemed to me to have that same sense of recursiveness at its core. Is that right, or is this resonating, or did I imagine that?
Well, first explain what he means by recursiveness to our vast listening audience who might not get that idea.
Well, I think that, let me say this, I think the idea that the view would be sort of that we're caught in various kinds of loops of consciousness that repeat various forms and ideas that, rather than sort of originating and moving in linear time. Is that the idea, John? Yeah, I think that is part of at least the indigenous worldview of the Nahua, the Aztec, that the world that we inhabit is one that is, as they say, is a mask of reality. We perceive the world in a certain way, but it's not necessarily the way the world is, and the world moves between different kinds of oscillations of reality. So there's a term that the Aztecs use called nepantla. We are in between realities. And part of the precariousness of life is thinking that the world is always going to be this way, and it never changes, and it's never going to be different than the way it is. The Aztec worldview suggests is that we don't really know how the world is, but we have to understand that there's a danger and also possibility, given that these changes are going to happen in our own self, right, but also in the way that the world presents itself to us.
I want to take a question from this side of the room. Welcome to Philosophy Talk.
Okay. My name is Julian, And I was wondering who was the most famous Latin American philosopher.
That's a good question. How old are you, Julie?
I'm 10.
You're the youngest person ever to ask a question on philosophy class. Thank you for coming. So,
I don't know if there's a most famous one. There's some that are definitely much more influential than others. And by that, usually that means people who have read him in English. So there are various figures that have gotten noticed by people as philosophers. But this is part of one of the problems that Latin Americans have, is that, well, no one's reading us. No one pays attention to us. Everyone's reading the Europeans or thinking that everything happens either at Stanford or Harvard. But what about what's going on in the National University of Mexico? What's going on in the universities of Buenos Aires? And so this is one of the worries that Latin Americans have, is that you guys seem to not want to pay attention to us, but we have something interesting to say. So maybe you should get off your high horses and think about the rest of the world.
So look, we're going to do our part to give more attention to Latin American philosophy just after a break. You're listening to Philosophy Talk. We're discussing Latin American philosophy with Joseph Orosco, director of the Peace Studies program here at Oregon State University.
Where is Latin American philosophy going? Is it being influenced by or having an influence on the post-Castro social and political trends in Latin America? We'll tackle these issues, maybe, in our next segment.
We're coming to you from OSU in Corvallis. We'll take more questions from our live audience when Philosophy Talk continues.
Welcome back to the program. I'm John Perry. This is Philosophy Talk, the program that questions everything
except your intelligence. I'm Ken Taylor. We're discussing Latin American philosophy with Joseph Orosco from Oregon State University. And we've got a whole lineup of questioners in our live audience, and I'll go from this side of the room to that side. We'll start over there. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, sir.
Greetings. Michael Fortune, Corvallis. I wonder what our guest and our two hosts have to say about the very different reaction of Latin American peoples and North American people to the war in the Malvinas in the 1980s. For some in the audience, you may understand that as the Falklands. But there was a war in which Argentina seized the Malvinas Islands, and Britain went to war and retook them after 2 months. It seems that there was a very different concept of due process, which is deeply rooted in American thinking and is largely not present in Latin American thinking, among other differences. Would you comment?
Well, I think, first of all, it's just very interesting to see the sort of power dynamic in the way in which that conflict is referred to, right? If you are in Anglo-speaking territories, it's usually called the Falklands War, which is how it tends to be referred to in the United States. But I was in Argentina last year teaching, and I was told, first off, don't ever bring up this war, right? You'll get into a bar fight. And the other thing is, don't call it the Falklands War. Right, call it Malvinas, right? And so I think that sort of shows this kind of dual perspectivism that exists, that if you come from Latin America, you have a different understanding of how power works in the region, and that influences, I think, this understanding of the philosophy of liberation in Latin America, is that the philosophers of liberation in Latin America say, we are trying to articulate or try to get out there a sense of how we can express how we see the world. And most frequently, the way that the world has been seen is through the eyes of the British or the Americans.
But I want to ask you more about how we see the world. What's that? Because one of the things about Latin America, I was an exchange student in the 70s in Brazil. And they're fabulously wealthy people in those days in Brazil, but there were also desperately poor people. And in that time, my Brazilian host family, they were sort of progressive kind of people, but they were way less progressive than I was. Right? They were indifferent to all this poverty around them. You know, they were living it up. I mean, who's we in Latin America when countries are sometimes so divided, when the poor are so very poor and the wealthy are so very wealthy? I gather there's a growing middle class throughout Latin America, but, you know, it hasn't always been so. So liberation from the United States, I think liberation from the Latin American elites is one of the things that's demanded.
Absolutely, and I think that for liberation philosophy, that is an awareness, is that an awareness of how power is hierarchicalized in various different kinds of societies, and to recognize, I think, that the elites that are in control of Latin America are most frequently aligned with the powers of the global elite.
So, but here's a question for you then. I mean, so, look, there are all kinds of cool Enlightenment philosophies, Locke, Rousseau, all those guys who talk about the essential humanity of us all, the shared humanity, the equal standing of... Why not import those ideas? Are those alien ideas? I mean, those seem like they might be fruitful ideas for people at the barricades.
I think that there is an emphasis on trying to make sure that we understand the importance of things like human rights, how we inhabit the world in a shared kind of conception. But the Latin American perspective, and at least in liberation philosophy, is to understand that that's also very abstract, right? And that the kinds of problems of oppression and poverty that are experienced, for instance, in the United States, are not the same kinds of poverty that are experienced in Latin America. And so that we need to have a fine-tooth, context-dependent understanding of what it means to be a human being.
I just want to go back to the issue of the Malvinas. Is that how I probably would have called them Falklands if I haven't just been educated. I remember my attitude was deep ambivalence, because if you look at a map and you look at where the Falklands are, you say, geez, those belong to Argentina. And you say, well, through some fluke of history, somebody else owns them. Guess who? Same people that own Gibraltar and Hong Kong. So I wasn't very sympathetic with the British, but then when push came to shove, I wasn't too sympathetic with Argentina either, because my conception of Argentina is a very rich group of people who take time out to put on shows like Evita, and many of whom are ex-Nazis. And that's probably naive.
And that regime was not. A very progressive, forward-looking
Absolutely not.
regime.
No.
So well, we've got more questions from our live audience. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, sir.
Hi, thank you. My name is John Knight. I'm from Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and my question is somewhat of a two-parter. First of all, the Nueva Canción movement in the latter half of the 20th century seemed to have flavors of traditional, modern, as well as indigenous points of view, and I'm curious how that reflects the philosophical movements of the same time period, but also how did that movement and the philosophical movements, I guess, or thought processes of that same time period reflect an emergence or a lack of emergence of female participation in philosophy?
Well, Nueva Canción, which means new song, was a folk music movement that was started in the late 60s and early 70s that was located in grassroots popular class struggles against military dictatorships and against wealthy oligarchs. And the attempt was to try to combine pre-Columbian rhythms with contemporary folk instruments, and to give voice to a new emerging youth movement that would try to tap into the growing youth movements that were going on in Europe and in Latin America. So this was all around the time of the Berkeley movements as well. So it was an attempt by Latin American youth to have a distinct musical form. And part of it was this conception of trying to blend the modern with the indigenous. And so a famous group is Inti Illimani, who tries to combine important indigenous instruments with contemporary music. And there were important female artists in that movement. Violeta Parra is a very important figure in all of that. But in Latin American philosophy, and this is true, there have not been a lot of women recognized as important philosophers. And this has partly to do, or I think largely to do, actually, with the patriarchal nature of Latin American society.
So I want to ask you a question about this. Look, that's true of many formations of philosophy. There haven't been a lot of women historically involved as the major players in philosophy, although there are growing numbers. But when I was a young guy struggling with what I'm going to do with my life, and I got this philosophy bug, one thing I worried about was whether a black reflective guy could authentically be a philosopher, since it was dominated by white male European types. I mean, if philosophy is this white male Anglo-dominated thing, what really is in it for us dispossessed people?
I think that's precisely the question that Latin Americans try to deal with. There is this view that philosophy is universal, that human beings all share certain important characteristics, and we need to emphasize that perspective. But the Latin American perspective, at least from philosophy of liberation, is to say, well, it's true that we share certain commonalities, certain notions of rationality and imagination and hope, but we live these characteristics in very particular modes. We experience them in very important philosophical contexts that may be different given our aspects. And Latin American philosophers have always talked about the importance of focusing on geography, for instance, or of weather patterns, right? Simón Bolívar, who was the liberator of Latin America from the Spanish, was also a philosopher, and he said, look, what we need to think about when we're building new societies, new democratic republics in Latin America, is we need to think about whether or not democracy is supported by the weather in Latin America. And so there's a long tradition in Latin America about thinking about things like geography, about the climate, that we need to pay attention to these kinds of things when we're deciding about how to live our lives and what kind of social and political systems we can create.
I'm a little skeptical about that because for years I've been told by our philosophical brethren in Boston and New York that you've got to have a lot of rain to do philosophy. You've got to be hopelessly cooped up in your study. It's just inconsistent with the climate of California, and I don't buy that for a minute.
So we've got another question on this side of the room.
I'm Lena Roth. I'm from Corvallis. You said that Latin American philosophy was born out of the experience of suffering and the view of life as precarious. And I was wondering how people relate to that suffering. Do they see it as a penance, or do they accept it as okay, or see it as even righteous?
Well, at least for the ancient Aztecs, that was just the way it was, and you had to sort of deal with it. You had to recognize that the world is a precarious place, and there are these texts about their parental advice to parents about how you should raise your young. And over the message is you need to tell your kids that life is full of suffering and pain, and the best things in life are good food, community, and being able to go to bed and forget about your problems. So there's all this advice about trying to deal with the suffering that we have, recognizing that the pleasure and the good things are momentary and fleeting, and we can't always bank on that. So it's a question of how to deal with living in between life and death, pleasure and pain, being nimble in terms of dealing with suffering and recognizing that suffering is an important part of our lives. And this is, of course, at the basis of great religions like Buddhism, is how to deal with suffering. It's a reality of our life. And how we deal with that is one of the eternal questions of existence.
Let's take a final question on this side of the room. Welcome to Philosophy Talk, ma'am.
I'm Julian's grandmother. I am a Latin American, and I always said, who am I? And you're trying to tell me. And many times I said, I cannot be a Latin American and fit a pattern because we are so different, so many things. But now that I'm 68, I'm thinking that we have something in common, all of us in Latin America. And I think we are culturally mixed. We may not be racially mixed, but they're different races, but I think we're adaptable, and we all carry a little bit of the cultures of all the people who have influences us. The richest, most arrogant person in La Paz, Bolivia, who has these cocktail parties and plays golf, and it's the upper class. Inside, remember his nanny was a Native American. Inside him, there's a lot of Inca culture. And I think Gabriel Garcia Marquez talks to us in those circles of who we are. And that was just a comment. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you want to make a closing remark about that, or I'll let you comment on that, or whatever you want to before I say goodbye to you?
Garcia Marquez is one of my favorite authors, and I think that sometimes the genre that he creates of magical realism strikes people kind of odd. Right? But it's quite common for, even in Latinos in the United States, to talk about the reality of living with spirits, of living with things that sort of seem supernatural and out of the ordinary, and thinking that this is just part of our lives. We understand that our existence is oscillating, once again, between reality and unreality. And Garcia Marquez tries to capture that, understanding that history changes, and that the past really sometimes isn't the past. It's right here in front of us, and that sometimes spirits do sit at the table with us, and that this is part of the Latin American experience of understanding that what we see in front of us isn't always the whole story of our existence.
Well, on that intriguing note, I'm going to thank you for joining us. It's been a very interesting conversation. I know we've just scratched the surface, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Our guest has been Joseph Orosco. He's a professor of philosophy right here at OSU in Corvallis, where he's also the director of the Peace Studies program.
We also want to thank everyone in our live audience for participating in the program. Give yourselves a round of applause.
So, John, that was quite a tour. I mean, there's lots more we could have talked about, but where is your thinking now?
Well, my thinking is that I want to do something about these big gaps in my knowledge between, De las Casas and, Borges and a couple of other things. There's so much interesting that's going on. And particularly what intrigues me is the whole story of those years when Mexico and Latin America was culturally way in advance of the Puritan witch and book burners of America, and how what happened there, and what was the thinking?
But that was a period of Catholic scholasticism, and I think Catholic scholasticism, even though I went to a great Catholic university and imbibed a lot of that stuff, but like you said, we just barely scratched the surface. But the conversation will continue, as it always does, on our blog, the blog.philosophytalk.org, where our motto is cogito ergo blogo. I think, therefore I blog. And you can also find out more by visiting our very active Facebook page.
And you can sign up to get free weekly podcasts of Philosophy Talk at our website, philosophytalk.org. For the final word, we speed read our way through Latin America with Ian Scholes, the 60-second philosopher.
Ian Scholes, it's kind of a trope in Latin American literature to not write books. As a writer, I admire that. Borges, rather than writing an entire book, would choose instead to pretend that the book already existed and write a review of it. Roberto Bolaño, the Chilean writer, did the same thing with his book, Nazi Literature in the Americas. He made up a whole roster of fascist writers with bibliographies, summaries of their works, and full Wikipedia-type entries about them. Now, here in the U.S., if we wanted to write a fascist novel, by golly, we'd sit down at the word processor and not get up until the darn thing was done. But really, why go to all the trouble? At the end of the day, all you'll have to show for your effort is an 800-page tome that will only be read by white supremacists, and them only for the first 20 pages or so. How much better just to review the non-existent book than lie down and take a nap? We could take a page from Latin American literature in all walks of life. Why spend the millions of dollars to make another Transformers movie, for instance? Why not just get all the nation's critics to review the imaginary movie, reveal spoilers, and make everybody think they've already seen it? This could be a big help in the ongoing budget crisis. Rather than spending money we don't have, why don't we just pretend that we do have it? If everybody agrees that we have the money, it's the same thing, isn't it? That's not to say that we need to spend it. Instead of buying the next iteration of big screen TVs, smartphones, computers, and automobiles, all we have to do is tell others, oh yeah, I got that. What are they going to do, call you a liar? After all, they're pretending they have one too. Come to think of it, we're already pretty good at this. The Tea Party is pretending really hard that the U.S. is actually the same as it was back in the 1950s, and its adherents are busily chipping away at everything that does not enforce that delusion. Now, who knows? It just might work. Unfiltered cigarettes, cocktail hours, drive-in movies, poodle skirts, hula hoops, TV westerns, variety shows, the Rat Pack, big thin Cadillacs, our old friend the Cold War. For all we know, they may already be back among us. We are affected every day by things that don't exist. Zombies, vampires, psychics, reliable economic forecasts. The free lunch, cheap gasoline, straight male hairdressers, brass tacks, quick fixes, easy answers, liberals, Eisenhower Republicans, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I tell you, I could write a book, but I probably won't and pretend I did. I gotta go.
Philosophy Talk is a presentation of Ben Manila Productions and the trustees of Leland Stanford Junior University, copyright 2011.
Our executive producer is David Demers, and we'd like to express thanks to Bill Ugalis, Lois Robertson, John Gridanis, James Dominic, John Dorbolo, Eric Gleski, Eddie Underwood, Jessica Coronado, the OSU Philosophy Department, the Associated Students of Oregon State, and the staff of the LaSalle Stewart Center.
Thanks also to Mark Davis, Joel Groves, Merle Kessler, Caitlin Esch, Dave Millar, and Corey Goldman. And a very special thanks to Vice Provost Larry Roper and Professor Courtney Campbell.
Our production coordinator is Devin Strolovich. Ben Hirsch is our Director of Research. Lael Weiss is our webmaster.
Support for Philosophy Talk comes from various groups at Stanford University, the Friends of Philosophy Talk,
and from the members of KALW, local public radio San Francisco, where our program originates.
The views expressed or misexpressed on this program do not necessarily represent the opinions of Stanford University or of our other funders.
Even when they're true and reasonable. The conversation continues on our website, philosophytalk.org.
I'm John Perry.
And I'm Ken Taylor. Thank you for listening.
And thank you for thinking.